to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, Amanda Lamb. Remote teaching during the pandemic, well, it wasn't the best way for many students to learn, but it was a stopgap measure to help schools get through the crisis. Now, some schools across the state are finding themselves turning to virtual teaching companies to help them fill vacancies left by an extreme teacher shortage. In this episode, WRAL education reporter Emily Walkenhorst joins us to talk about what these companies do and how this virtual education experiment is going. Emily, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
So I understand 16 school systems or charter schools in our state employ virtual teachers, and they can be teaching from anywhere in the country. So explain how this all works, if you will.
Yeah, so these teachers could just be living in another part of North Carolina, or they could be living in Chicago or Detroit or Seattle. Basically, what they do is they just beam into the classroom via a webcam. And then there's like an interface online where they can post lessons and, all of the coursework. And the students can go back and forth through a chat device in that interface with the teacher. And so basically, it's kind of like just a typical classroom, except that you can't just raise your hand and talk to a teacher. You can put your question in a chat and the teacher will respond that way, either through the chat or just through responding in their microphone to the class. All the students are there in person. And there's typically a classroom coach. So maybe somebody who's, qualified or trained to be a substitute teacher is basically this full-time classroom coach, and they make sure the students stay on task. They might provide any kind of extra academic help that a student might need. And so there's really kind of two adults teaching the class, but only one is physically there.
And they could be in California, they could be in Chicago, they can be anywhere.
Yeah, anywhere.
That's amazing. So at the beginning of the school year, North Carolina schools reported more than 3,500 vacancies. Why do we have such a shortage? And are there certain subjects where the needs are the greatest or certain school levels?
So the shortage has gotten kind of worse over the years. And one of those reasons, well, there are many reasons that people point to. Pay, just not kind of keeping up with other sectors that also require a bachelor's degree. College is getting more expensive. And so how much money are some of these careers that you can major in and prepare for in college really end up paying? So there's a lot of calculus around how, around teacher salary. You also hear from teachers that they just have more and more on their plate every year. So there's kind of a retention issue and a recruitment issue of teachers. We've always had a shortage of science, math, and special education teachers, but now we're also seeing some shortages in K through 6, second grade teachers. And there's been some improvement in the last year compared to, where we were at the start of the school year in 2022. But, 3,500 is still a lot compared to what it used to be. That might be a few percent, which is better than a lot of other industries. But in the education world, you feel it so much more.
Sure.
Because
you
there's
can't,
literally not a teacher.
You can't afford to have vacancies like that. Well, we will be right back after the break. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. So, Emily, I know a lot of parents weren't thrilled about remote learning during the pandemic. And the difference here, obviously, is that the children are in the classroom and the teacher is remote. But, how are parents, how are schools, how are they adapting to this?
So there's a lot of skepticism at first from parents. We've kind of heard in some cases parents have gotten used to it, but it's a very jarring experience to find out that a teacher is virtual. And it does make you think back to remote learning, which we know didn't have the greatest of academic outcomes for students. They really had a much slower pace of learning, and we've seen some drops in test scores since that. So there is a lot of skepticism around that, but it is still somewhat different. The students are still around each other. They're able to interact with each other and have a social experience. Um, and then these are also virtual teachers working for companies that, are set up specifically for this purpose and have been for years. So there's not necessarily a haphazard transition to virtual learning where people really haven't been trained or prepared for it. There's at least a little bit more preparation here. But, in terms of the actual outcomes of will this be good for students, we'll kind of have to wait and see. The one principal I talked to said students, seem to do about just as well in their virtual teachers last year as maybe some other students in the school district. But that's a pretty small sample size. And, we'll really kind of have to wait and see how it goes.
Yeah, long term. And I know that you're talking about the school that you interacted with. That was Northern Granville Middle School, where they are spending, I think, $1 million, according to your reporting, on virtual teaching. And, I know that a lot of people are probably trying to compare this to remote learning, but it is very different. Why are they saying this works better than the remote learning did?
So partly this is, they're more optimistic about this because, these teachers are still certified in the subject area. So if they are teaching a math class, they're likely to be certified in math teaching. So how that might compare to if you just had a vacancy and, you couldn't hire a math teacher in person. Basically, this is somebody who is certified and able to teach the classroom versus, say, a long-term substitute teacher, or if you had to ask another teacher in the building to cover.
To cover, right, and it wasn't their subject. What's the benefit to the educators who do this? I mean, I guess they have a lot of flexibility, I would imagine.
Yeah, which is very different from how teaching is really set up these days. So, some of the thinking among, a lot of people is this is kind of the teaching workforce, at least starting to enter some of that flexibility we've seen in other sectors where people are able to work from home. But, this is still on a very small scale. So, there might be a lot of teachers who appreciate this flexibility, but, they might not be getting paid quite as much because they are currently still contractors. This is not necessarily something that's being deployed at scale by school systems themselves. And so they might be getting paid a little bit less. But at the same time, they're also doing a little bit less. There's no, after school, duties or before school duties, no lunch school duty. You don't have to necessarily attend certain sporting events just to make sure there's an educator at the event. And so there is just a little bit less responsibility for some of these stressed teachers.
And I know you said it's going to be a long time before we see, the outcomes of this, but did the students seem to be taking or adapting well to this?
So I talked to a couple of students and they said it took some getting used to, but it seemed to be a little natural to some of them. One of them said, "Hey, my generation, we spend a lot of time in tech. We're really immersed in tech. So, once you kind of get used to it, it's not that hard to use the platform. You kind of expect to have a lot of things online, a lot of texts and resources online. And so, it seems like a more natural transition once you just realize that your teacher is, not physically there and you get used to using the chat function. The chat function seems to be very important for students to be able to build a relationship with their teacher. So, that might take some initiative on the part of the teacher or even the student to make sure that they use that. But, if you can do that and if you can get used to it, it seems that some of the students are responding well to it.
And do you think we're going to see more of this in the future?
So there's certainly a lot of people who think that this could be at least partly the future. Right now, these virtual teachers are, coming from private companies, they're contractors, they aren't earning quite as much money. So it's not necessarily something that is, um, you know, a total replacement for teaching right now. You might actually make more money as an in-person teacher. So it seems that schools still really want to go in the direction of having an in-person teacher, but at least these virtual teachers might be somewhat of a stopgap for schools that are struggling to hire a permanent teacher. And it's entirely possible that we'll see more schools signing contracts to fill open slots.
Absolutely. Well, Emily, thank you so much for explaining all this. For more news from WRAL, sign up for the WRAL Morning Briefing newsletter. You'll be informed and ready to face the day with one concise email. Sign up at wral.com/newsletter. As always, thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download.